Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Super Feeler podcast. My name is Lori, and I'm joined again today by Dave and Megan. And we're going through our DBT for Life book together. This week, we're talking about validation. So really important, not only like DBT kind of concept, but also just in our general lives. We often are not validated in the way that we need to. And many people believe that borderline personality disorder actually comes from an invalidating environment as kids. So it's a very important topic for all of us. Just note, disclaimer, none of us are clinicians. We're all just people whose lives have been changed by borderline, or by borderline 100%, but our lives have been changed by dialectical behavior therapy. And so we're just kind of going through these skills as a reminder. So I'll pass to Dave to go over the story.
This is a difficult story. Hopefully I won't say anything that offends anybody or that triggers anybody, but, I'm going to try my best. So in this story, it's about a woman having a conversation with her quite old mother. And this woman, who I think is in her mid-40s, when she was quite young, she was assaulted by her uncle, her mother's brother. And it's something that her mother has never acknowledged. And not only that, but, when they've had discussions about it before, because it's very important for the daughter, that she finds that it's very, very important for her, and she's really struggling with life. And part of it, she's very clear that she really needs her mom to acknowledge what happened to her and also to apologize. And whenever she's had discussions with her mom about it, it just devolves into a mess, and her mom says hurtful and validating things, and it's really awful. And so this story is really basically just, another time when they're sitting there watching TV and the daughter decides to bring it up. And I think this goes with the validation skill, where the daughter makes a decision to, in a DBT way, when her mom says invalidating things or tries to avoid having the conversation, or even, says things like, well, people make up these kind of accusations all the time, or things that are really hurtful. The daughter makes a decision to not to sort of engage with that. And to the extent that her mom sort of, gives her clues about things she's thinking, that, she was doing her best, she was really tired, things that they aren't excuses. And the daughter is like, she has to sort of clench down hard to do it. But, she finds a way to verbalize validation of these things that her mom is saying, and also to sort of state in a factual way, in a maybe not quite a dear man kind of way, but in a sticking to the facts kind of way, what it is that happened to her. And in the end, her mom does say she's sorry and asks for her forgiveness. So that's the story.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, it was a tough story for sure. And I think in some ways, not necessarily just in this context, but we've all been there, right? Where we've really needed to hear something from someone. And I think there's so much dialectic in the story of, I'm sure she was doing her best and it wasn't enough to protect me. That came through really clearly. And you could feel the sadness of the mother realizing that, like, she needed to say sorry, but she was so ashamed that saying sorry was going to be really difficult for her. Does anybody have any reflections on this story?
Obviously, we don't, I'm not the person, I'm not anybody else, I'm just me. But if I was in this situation, having this kind of conversation, and I felt like to get an apology, I had to verbalize and validate things that I really thought were total bullshit and were on their own really hurtful. I don't know whether the apology would do the trick then. Would it really have the effect that I'm hoping for? Just for me. I mean, that idea of, to me, validation for me has worked the best when it's genuine, or at least there's enough genuineness to it, and I'm not just making it up to try to get the person to apologize, because then, or to do something, because then seems kind of meaningless to me. I don't know, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just kind of found this chapter kind of interesting in terms of a lot of it feels like it's about validating others, and I know we can only control what we do, but a lot of the time, like Lori said in the intro, like we've been coming out of a period of like invalidation, and so I feel like it feels hard to validate when you're feeling invalidated yourself. So I think I'd echo kind of what Dave said, is that like I think if I felt like I had to validate things that I didn't feel were valid just to get validation myself, it would feel kind of like icky, like a little tainted. So yeah, I'm interested what Lori thinks on that.
Yeah, I've had a very similar conversation where was looking for validation and I was kind of the one ending up validating the other person. And it didn't feel good because I still never got what I want or what I needed. I guess I don't even want to say want, like what I needed. But I think sometimes there's people in the world that just, for whatever reason, just can't provide that to you. And so I'm glad in this story that at least her mom was able to say sorry, even if it was like whispered under her breath. You know, it was what she needed. And sometimes I feel like this might be a controversial statement. On occasion, I feel like validation is like almost overused in that we have to, every single thing is you need to validate this, you need to validate this, you need to validate this. And that can become almost like taking away it like dilutes it sometimes. So yeah, all of the things that this daughter had to validate that her mom was doing, I think, or wasn't doing, I guess, honestly, it's fair to say that like, yes, like that was probably really hard for you. And like, I'm really sorry that that happened or that you felt that way or that you didn't know or whatever. But at the same time, like, I think the mom maybe would have done better with a more structured approach in saying like, I need to hear this from you, which I don't remember if that really was like explicitly said, because her mom was being kind of an asshole at some points. Like, that's a very popular accusation these days. Good gracious, the nonsense people will say to get attention. Yes, she came around 2 pages later, but in real life, like, is that person gonna come around that quickly? I'm not totally sure. And then is it just like fighting an uphill battle that's maybe not, I don't know. I'm not loving what I'm saying right now. But it just doesn't feel like she was able to get what she needed in like a real way.
Yeah. I'm kind of just skimming the page that says exploring validation again, and even just like having this conversation and then reading it again is like, it's interesting what sticks out to me now. Like validation transforms conversations. It communicates, I've heard what you were saying and I understand what you were feeling even if I don't agree. And I guess that and also there's another part that's like the idea of responding to invalidation with validation can be very upsetting to some people. Point proven. Uh but remember, the key here is that you're focused on what's effective. Even if you don't like what the other person is saying, you can shift a conversation by acknowledging their emotional experience or the reasons for their opinions. And I think that that's probably like the important part to focus on, is like encouraging people that like, I say this to my like friends a lot in terms of like, it's okay to feel your feels, not like shutting people down in terms of like, something I also say quite often is like, if it matters to you, it matters.
Yes.
And in terms of like, yeah, it's not like the most devastating thing in the world. Like you're dealing with like quote unquote first world problems or whatever in this moment, but it matters to you. So therefore it matters. And I think that kind of validation can be easier to do in a conversation where you're like, okay, I understand that this matters to you. You don't have to necessarily think it matters. Like it doesn't have to matter to you, but validating that you understand where they're coming from, even if you don't think it's correct. And I think that might be like kind of the shift that maybe I need to make when I'm thinking of validation. Yeah, it's interesting to me, the idea of validating others when you're being invalidated. But you can only control yourself.
Yeah, you can only control yourself. And I think it's totally fair to say, like, out loud, I don't agree with you, but your emotions are valid. And my husband says that to me all the time. He's like, I don't get it. I disagree. I don't necessarily like it, but I understand that what you're feeling is really valid for you. And sometimes that's helpful, right? Like, because I can get really like spirally and like really angry. And I know it upsets him. And he maybe feels invalidated, but he's like, this is clearly very real for you. I don't like it. And then that's really real for him, right? I mean, fair enough. It doesn't mean I can stop. Doesn't mean I'm going to stop. But at least we both know where each other is at. And I liked this point here about when you validate someone, you're creating an opening for them to drop their defenses and be vulnerable enough to hear your perspective. And I don't ever really think of validation in that way, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, you hear this in, what was I watching the other day? I was watching Grey's Anatomy. Bailey was being like, because of the abortion work that she was doing, was being like harassed, like badly. And so to respond, spoiler alert, I guess, I don't know, it's a very small component here, but like the other doctors and stuff would call the people that were like harassing her and say like, I hear you. Like that sounds really hard to imagine if you feel this way. Or it was a really beautiful scene, honestly, where they were basically saying like, yeah, that does sound really stressful and that does sound really hard. And I totally hear you. And just saying that was enough to kind of like have them drop the, like, it's us versus them. Like we can both have our same perspective or different perspectives, but still both feel really distressed by it. And that's okay. And I really liked that. And I also really liked this like kind of highlighted section around, you have my full attention and I want to understand. Because I think sometimes around validation, it's easy for people to be like, yeah, totally, your emotions are valid. And that's kind of what I meant earlier, but like it gets a little bit watered down. Instead of going like, I'm totally listening and I want to hear how you feel about this. And I want to be able to say, I'm hearing you and what you are experiencing is valid, as opposed to just like, yeah, everybody's emotions are valid, which they are, but it takes away from the kind of important part there, I think.
Lori, I like what you just said a minute ago about the part about dropping defenses, which I think, to me, it's felt like the most important part of validation. I think it occurs to me that in situations like this story, where someone's done something that is just objectively, hurtful, in this case, ignoring very real abuse of a mother's child, and then being unwilling to confront it, I can imagine that for the mother, as for a lot of people in this situation, it's like, when I've done something wrong and someone is confronting me about it, my mind is just limited to like, oh, I did this thing wrong. It becomes, I am just at my core a bad person generally. And so I think that validation, like in this case, I can imagine that the daughter is saying, you like, I understand, they're sort of like, oh, I was tired and all this stuff. It's a way of trying to get around that and be like, I may have made this mistake, but people like, I can't admit that I made a mistake without getting around this whole thing of like, you clearly believe that I am just at base, at core, an awful person. And so validation, I think, is a really powerful way to unlock that. Even if you're just saying, I understand that you're feeling this way. Like I understand why you're feeling this way. Not like the only kind of person who could feel the way you're feeling is an awful person. And so therefore the fact that you're feeling this means that you are just an awful person. It helps people to relax a little bit, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. And I liked that she separated like the how to validate, because it goes beyond the just like, your emotions are valid. So she talks about body language, reflective listening, mind reading. So being open to correction is crucial, and not trying to assume that we know what other people are thinking and imagine their motives. So again, that's like considering the good intent, but also skillful mind reading can be an effective approach to validating others. So I don't really love calling this skillful mind reading, but like reflecting on what the other person is saying and reading body language, which we're so good at as people, as super feelers, right? We're just incredible at reading every tiny little shift in tone and facial expression and body language. So trying to validate what might not be explicitly said, that's an important skill for us to have. And then, given everything that happened, it makes sense that you feel this way, is kind of one of those key words that she talks about. So this, in the story, she says, given that you loved Uncle Billy, it makes sense that you didn't want to think badly of him. And I think that's a fair statement. The fifth, kind of how to validate, anyone would feel this way given the circumstances or with your history or situation. I feel like I use that a decent amount, but I can't really think of an example right now. Okay, so then the sixth one is radical genuineness. So this is the sweetest form of validation. Radical genuineness is hard to rehearse because it comes straight from the heart and in the moment. It makes the person feel like this person really gets me, they understand. And I think that's one of the beauties of being a super feeler, is that we can do that so easily, right? We just get people and they feel heard and validated by us in so many contexts. And it's kind of just like one of those natural superpowers that we have. And then she talks about what you can possibly agree with. So is there any part of what's going on where you can give a little bit and say like, yeah, I can understand that, as opposed to saying like, I know that that's how you're feeling, but I don't understand, or I don't agree. I challenge the clients to think of the most invalidating thing someone's ever said to them and look for a way that they can validate in what the other person said. So then there's the, quick guide to the 6 levels of validation on page 141, attentive body language, reflective listening, mind reading. Given all that happened, it makes sense. Anyone would feel this way, and radical genuineness. Does anybody have any thoughts on those pieces?
Yeah, I just, and I don't know if it's specifically on those pieces in particular, but I think one of the things that's really hard for me about validation is particularly in like sort of long running high conflict situations where, partly it's valid and partly it, in my mind, but it becomes its own sort of loop, is like that feeling that like, if I validate someone, they're going to use it against me, right? Like if I say, you're right to feel this way, then either right then they're going to be like, aha, so therefore you have to do what I want. Or if not now, like in the future, they'll be like, oh, like you said that I was right to feel this way. And it becomes a little sticky sometimes because, on the one hand, like, that sometimes that means I think it is a valid reason not to validate someone if you feel like it's just going to get used against you in the future. But it also sometimes means that like I have to kind of fight through it when it feels like it's like I have to ask myself, like, do I really not want to validate because it's going to get used against me in the future in a way that is actually going to affect me? Or is it that I'm just worried about that, like, if I validate the other person, then it's going to sort of like give them points and they're going to win or something like that, which that's more of like a me problem and could get in the way of like actual effectiveness. I don't know if that's an experience you guys have run into.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that comes to this like kind of like vindictive part of me that I wish I could change, but I don't want to let the other person win ever. And that's not a good thing. Like, I'm not proud of that. It makes me really like competitive and good at things because I'm very stubborn. But I think for those people, Dave, I'd be curious, are those people that often are completely invalidating to you?
Yeah.
Because I can't think of a person where that I have that context where, or that conflict where I'm not wanting to validate them because I want them to like use it against me if they weren't already using everything against me that they could. And so maybe those are the people where we have to go back to that clarifying priorities and go, is this a relationship I need to maintain? Because that's not a comfortable relationship to be in. In some contexts, it might be a relationship you need to maintain. If you are a parent and have children and you need to deal with the other person, or it's your boss, then yeah, maybe. But is there a way to like kind of be able to maintain your self-respect in addition to maintaining that relationship, I think is like that triangle of clarifying priorities. That's really interesting.
Probably mostly, I mean, that's really helpful you said that, because I think, it probably is mostly just showing a lack of self-confidence on my part. That like, if I was really confident in what I wanted and confident that I was a good person, then someone turning around later and being like, you validated this thing for me, that it wouldn't bother me. Or I could like imagine someone who was feeling confident that they could just brush that off,
Yeah. And I think maybe it's like that you can validate without agreeing with them in that situation. But again, that's for people that have gone through DBT and understand how validation works and understand that you don't have to agree with them and still be able to validate. Whereas a lot of the people that we're going to be doing that dance with aren't going to understand any of those nuances and be like, well, you said I was right. You said it was valid. So therefore, whatever you're saying is invalid.
Yeah. I also liked, circled something on page 140 next to keeping track of validating statements people say to you. It says, noticing and appreciating validation will help you feel good and will help you live in a validating mindset and validation mindset. And I really like that. It's hard for me to accept compliments. It's hard for me to accept validation from others. It makes sense to me that it would not just help make me feel good, but get me more of in a mindset. And frankly, also it's probably a good idea to reward people when they're giving genuine validation and not sort of like reject it or try to figure out reasons why they're not being genuine or something, but just to really lean into it. Probably a good idea.
Absolutely. Megan, do you have any last thoughts on the validation piece?
I think that we've had a really good conversation, and I think that also kind of going back to what Dave just said about like the validation mindset, kind of like practicing gratitude. Like if you don't do it often, it's hard to think of the gratitude in like bad situations, right? When you probably needed a little bit more. So I can see like practicing identifying when you've been validated could be very helpful in terms of like dealing with the feelings of invalidation, because you can like kind of pull it out a little bit easier.
Yeah, that's super true. And I do think it's something that we do as super feelers more naturally, just because I think supporting other people and validating other people is so much easier than validating ourselves. And that's where the challenge is for me, of going like, no, Lori, you're okay. This is fair. This is valid. Whereas I would say that to a person on the street, right? Like I saw a kid at Costco the other day throwing the biggest temper tantrum in the entire universe because he didn't get ice cream. And I could think of 100,000 reasons to validate that kid. But I wouldn't do that in my own situation if I was upset about not getting ice cream.
Yep.
Well,
Yeah,
in that case,
I think
let's all go get ice cream.
Yeah, let's go get ice cream. I think what you said though, Lori, about like I forget exactly how you worded it, but like about our superpower of like being able to validate. I think I noticed that a lot because a lot of people come to me for validation on things, like to be, like I was saying earlier, like something I say a lot to my friends is because people come to me because they feel like they can be validated. And I think that that's kind of a superpower because I'm so used to being invalidated that I want other people to feel that validation when I can provide it.
Yeah, totally. It's validating that we all feel that way. If that helps. Like, yeah, it's one of those classic, like, well, would you say this to a friend if they were feeling this way? And you're like, no, counselor, I'm fully aware that this is not what I would say to a friend, but I'm going to do it anyways to myself. Like, we all know the answer. That's a rhetorical question. Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for having this conversation. I just love these little mini sessions so much. They're so much fun. And we will be back with starting emotion regulation. We're already on unit 3, which is amazing. And I'm kind of sad because I want this to go on forever. So I'll see you guys in a couple of weeks.
Good.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Super Feeler podcast. Today's episode was recorded on the unceded and traditional territory of the Matsqui and Sumas First Nations. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps me reach more listeners like you, and we're always looking for improving the podcast. Remember, you can always stay connected with me on social media. You can follow us. The show notes will have all of the details for Instagram profiles. If you want to support the podcast and help me continue to bring great content, please consider joining the Superfeeler community on Patreon. Your support really means the world to me, and there's a variety of different options for support, including some free ones. For all information about the Superfeelers Club, which is the peer support that we run, including upcoming events and resources, head over to Eventbrite or laurieedmondson.com for more information. And if you have a topic that you want me to cover or a guest you'd love to hear from, please send me the suggestions. Always happy to hear them. Until next time, keep on superfeeling and living authentically. This is Laurie signing off of the Superfeeler podcast.